Albert, thank you so much for joining us and for your willingness to be our first person today. And I know you have so much to share with us, so we'll just jump in and start right away if you don't mind. Mm-hmm. World War II, of course, began in September 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. The following May in 1940, Germany attacked France. You were nearly 2 years old at that time. But before we turn to the war years and what it meant to your family and you, let's start first with you telling us a little bit about your family and their life in the years before Germany invaded France.
Well, excuse me. My parents, as you mentioned, were born in Istanbul, Constantinople in those days, in Turkey. And Turkey was part of the Ottoman Empire. But the Ottoman Empire during the First World War had the bad idea to side with Germany. And when Germany was defeated in the First World War, the Ottoman Empire was dismantled. It was already falling apart anyway. And at that point came a strong man called Mustafa Kemal, also known as Ataturk, which means the father of modern Turkey. And he tried to salvage whatever could be salvaged from the Ottoman Empire, which was Turkey itself. And at that point, the Jews in Turkey started to be a bit concerned because they had witnessed the genocide of the Armenians in the beginning of the century. And then when Ataturk came to power, the Greeks, there were a very strong Greek community living in Izmir, which is a port city on the Aegean Sea. They fled, they were kicked out, they were pushed out, I would say, encouraged to leave and go back to Greece. And so the Jews said, maybe we're next, you know. And so that's when my parents decided to immigrate and you know, when they were in Turkey, they were educated in a school of international association called Alliance Israélite Universelle, where education was given in French. So they were perfectly fluent in French. And so when they decided to move, they moved. It was a natural destination to them to go to France.
Albert, we'll interrupt for just a second. When they moved to France, they didn't move together, though, right?
No.
Right.
They didn't. They met in Paris.
They met in Paris. Okay.
I guess in those days it must have been an arranged marriage. I don't know exactly. Mm-hmm. I don't know the details. I was not there, but yes, they met in 1927 and married in 1928. Mm-hmm. And from that marriage, they had 4 children. That you saw the pictures. One of them, my twin brother, died at the age of 6 months, and but we were 3 children.
Albert, you described your father as a very smart but a self-educated man. Tell us a little bit about him.
Yeah, my father, at a very young age, had to quit school and start working to help his parents. So he was self-educated actually. But he spoke French. He was perfectly fluent in French, and but I think he went to school at the age of 10 or 11, and that's it.
And your mother, on the other hand, was very well educated.
My mother went all the way to what they call the brevet supérieur, which is more or less equivalent of today's baccalaureate. And so she was very good at French and at spelling and everything. And there's an anecdote that I wouldn't mention. When she came to France, she worked in a company she was the secretary to the boss, and one day she had to write a letter, and the address was Boulevard Haussmann. Haussmann was a baron who built modern Paris. Actually, the wide avenues in Paris were built by Baron Haussmann. But my mother, all she had heard about Haussmann was a former sultan by the name of Osman, O-S-M-A-N. So she wrote O-S-M-A-N instead of H-A-U-S-S-M-A-N. So her friends, her co-workers started to make fun of her, and she was defended by her boss, who said, when you speak another language the way she speaks French, you can make fun of her.
Albert, when your parents got married in Paris, how would you describe their economic circumstances?
It was not brilliant, actually. My father had to struggle to work 2 jobs at the same time, because my mother had to take care of the children, 3 young children. I was the youngest, but my sisters were not much older at that time. So she stayed home, and my father had to struggle with 2 jobs. He was working in that garment factory as the accountant. He was doing the payroll of all the employees. And at night, he would go to a movie theater in Paris and tear off the tickets, like you have today in the movie theaters. So he was juggling with 2 jobs. His boss, who was Jewish also, in this garment factory, allowed us to live in the janitor's apartment of the factory, so that I guess that it could save a little on the rent. Mm-hmm. So the economic situation was not brilliant.
Mm-hmm. Your parents, of course, born in Turkey. What was their citizenship status in France?
Well, as soon as they moved to France, they lost their Turkish citizenship, and they were stateless because they didn't get the French citizenship until much later. My father had applied for a naturalization in the 30s, but at one point, for whatever reason, all the applications were frozen. So they didn't get their French citizenship until after the war. And my father got his first French passport in 1948, 25 years after immigrating to France.
And so for that entire time, he had no citizenship. He was stateless.
Exactly. Yeah. And that was very bad, because when France was invaded and the Statute of the Jews was edicted, which was based on the Nuremberg laws, that were depriving the Jews in Germany from most of their basic rights, the French, the same rules applied to the French Jews in France, and when they started deporting the Jews, they started with the stateless. With the people who had French citizenship were spared, at least for a while, but the stateless were the first to be targeted.
So they were very vulnerable from the very beginning.
Absolutely.
So you were born in June 1938. In fact, you have a pretty big birthday coming up very shortly, and
don't rub it in.
No, okay. Enough said. And you, in your very early years, war began in Europe in September 1939. But in May 1940, Germany attacks France. And as they advanced on Paris, there was a mass exodus of people leaving Paris. I think estimates as much as 80% of the population, potentially.
Yes, I don't know what the proportion was, but yeah, it was beautifully described in some books, actually. Yes, the population of Paris fled, and not only from Paris, but from northern France, actually. Because when France was invaded, it was invaded through Belgium. Mm-hmm. So as soon as they entered into France, the people of France fled south. So that's how we ended up. My mother, my sisters, and I. My father stayed behind. He wanted to keep on working, to keep on making a living. But my mother and my sisters and I, we fled south. And the rest of the family also. My grandmother, an uncle and an aunt, and 2 cousins. My grandmother was killed during that exodus. by strafing, because when we were fleeing like that, we were under the fire of the Luftwaffe, which was the German Air Force, and the Italian Air Force also. It was called the stab in the back, actually. And my grandmother was killed by strafing. She was doing some errands, trying to get some food, I guess, for her. She was killed. And my uncle, aunt, and cousins were killed when a bomb fell on their car on a bridge in Orléans, which is on the bridge over the River Loire, which is about 60, 70 miles south of Paris. And that's where they were killed.
So now it's pretty much you and your sisters and your mother. Where did you go from there?
Well, first of all, we tried to stay there for a while. My mother told me, because all I'm telling you now about this exodus and all that, is what I got from my mother. I was 2 years old, so there's no way I can remember that. But we apparently, according to my mother, we even slept in one of the chateaux. The Loire, the River Loire is famous for its beautiful chateaus all along. Chenonceau, Chambord, and it's magnificent, really. And so we slept in one of these chateaux. Of course, we were sleeping on the floor, and my mother didn't have anything to feed me, and I was 2 years old, so I was crying. And still, according to my mother, she said at one point I was disturbing everybody. Everybody was trying to sleep in that chateau, and I was disturbing the peace there. And so a soldier, one of the soldiers who had managed to escape, because most of the French soldiers had been taken prisoner, this one has managed to escape, had a small flask of schnapps. He gave my mother a small shot of schnapps and said, give him that will calm him down. Apparently it works. It worked. So I had my first experience with schnapps at the age of 2.
And after calming down from there, your family would return to Paris. So you went back to Paris, and you remained in your own apartment in Paris until, I think, June of 1942. Yeah. What do you know about those 2 years after you went back under the Nazi occupation, and then the events that did lead to force you to leave your apartment in 1942?
Yeah. Well, finally, after a few weeks, I couldn't say whether it was a few weeks, a few days. I don't think it went more than a month. Anyway, we went back home because we had no money and we had nowhere else to go. We had nobody to sponsor us, to invite us to go to join them overseas. So we had to go home, and that's what we did. And at that point, the French, when France was invaded, I have to give you some historical background here. The French army was defeated. There was a battle called the Battle of France. The French army was defeated. The government capitulated. France capitulated. The government resigned. And a new government was formed under the hero of the First World War, Maréchal Pétain, who was the hero of Verdun. Verdun was a big battle in the First World War, but 20 years later, he was 20 years older, of course, and he was a bit senile, I don't know. Plus, he was, he belonged to the old bourgeoisie, stiff-necked and anti-Semitic. So he formed a government. He appointed a guy by the name of Pierre Laval as a prime minister, and Pierre Laval was a notorious anti-Semite. And they started to edict a statute of the Jews that was modeled after the Nuremberg laws that I mentioned before, that had deprived the Jews from Germany from all the basic rights. Lawyers were debarred, doctors were not allowed to practice medicine, teachers were kicked out of public school, and all sorts of things like that, some very basic rights. So the same rules apply to the French Jews in France by the French government, the collaborationist government.
During that time, was your father able to manage to continue working during that time?
Yeah, he worked. Yes, he kept on working because, as I said, the owner of the factory was a Jew. Mm-hmm. So until 1942, there was no. He kept on working. There was, of course, they had to register as Jews, so they had to go to the authorities. And my father was very eager to abide by the rules, by the laws, because he didn't want to have any trouble. He knew that he was already in a very precarious situation. So he had registered. He had registered to the French authorities. And when you registered, they would put a stamp on your identity card, Juif, Jew, and it would be a red stamp, you know. And that meant that if you were arrested in the street and people asked you to show your papers, you had to show that. When they saw the mention Juif like that, they would put you aside and send you to a transit camp north of Paris in Drancy. It's a suburb of Paris. And from there, that was the antechamber to Auschwitz. Mm-hmm. So it was very dangerous, and my parents were very concerned about that. Yes.
The way you put it to me, you said quote, the Nazis really turned the screws in June 1942. That's when things got even more dangerous in a dramatic way. Tell us about that.
Actually, they started rounding up people in 1941. Mm-hmm. The first roundups started in 1941. But June 16th and 17th was the biggest roundup of all, la rafle du Veldiv, where they rounded up. The Germans had asked for 20,000 men to go to work to Germany as slave labor. The French government obliged, but instead he sent 13,000, but men, women, children, elderly people, sick people, everybody was sent. And they were parked in a big stadium. There was a bicycle stadium. There was a track where there were races. There was a race called Les 6 jours, the 6 days. For 6 days, they were turning like that around the track. And they were parked about 13,000 people in that stadium. Of course, there had no food, no water. And you have to realize it was in July. It was very hot. And the people were sweating. They were thirsty. They didn't have access to water. The toilets were out of service very quickly, and they stayed there for about a week until eventually they were sent to transit camps south of Paris. You don't have two transit camps south of Paris, Pithiviers and Beaune-la-Rolande, and the mothers and the children were sent to these camps. And eventually the mothers were sent to Auschwitz, and the children followed a few days later. They had been separated from their parents already, and they were sent, and there were 4,000 children among the 13,000 people who were rounded up that time. And from the 4,000 children who were sent to Auschwitz, none of them came back.
And of course, Albert, as you said, that was the most infamous, largest roundup, but there were many, many others.
There were constant roundups like that, and that's why my parents were very concerned, and they wanted they tried to isolate us by sending us away, and they sent us to a farm outside of Paris in a place called Thoiry, which today is famous because it has a safari park. In those days, it was just farmland. And we were on a farm run by two ladies. I guess the men must have been taken prisoner with the French army. And they said to the lady, they didn't say that we were Jewish. They said that they had nothing to feed us, and we would be better fed on a farm than in Paris. So they sent us to that farm. And that was the winter of 42, 43. I remember that winter like it was yesterday. There was a lot of snow. It was beautiful, beautiful. My sisters would go to school. They were, at that time, they were 9 and 12. Mm-hmm. And so they would go to school, and I would stay with the ladies. They were raising pigs and rabbits, and I remember I would spend hours watching the rabbits, and that's all I was doing, you know. And I was happy there, and I was very social, so I was talking to the ladies. But my parents had not said that we were Jewish, but I told them. 4 years old, 4 and a half. So the ladies panicked, and they sent us right back to our parents. And at that point, my father took me aside and said, "Don't ever, ever say that you are Jewish." It was like a stigma, you know, to be Jewish. We were afraid, we were ashamed, and we were different from the others. And you know, a kid, 4 years old, 5 years old, all they want to blend with the rest of the kids. And I felt that I was different, and I was frustrated about that. And but we had, you know, I had to learn my lesson after having spoken the way I did to these two ladies. And so we went back to our apartment. I didn't tell you also
where you moved to.
Yes, in July 1942, with the new laws that were edicted by the new government, we had been expelled from our apartment. The owner of the garment factory was a Jew, so the factory was confiscated, was given to a non-Jewish manager, and the owner had to flee, and he went away. He came back, actually, after the war. But so at that point, with the new manager and the new collaborationist authorities in France, we were expelled from that apartment, janitor's apartment, and we had to find an apartment in no time. And we found an apartment in a big apartment complex. We had a two-room apartment, not a two-bedroom, two-room, a tiny kitchen, toilet, and that's it. No bathroom, nothing. And the only comfort we had was electricity and cold water. That was it. So we moved into that apartment. That was in July 1942, after we had, before we went to the farm, actually. So we went back to that apartment when we came back from the farm, and in September 1943, my father was summoned to go to mandatory labor service in a slave labor camp on the Channel Islands. The Channel Islands were 3 small islands off the coast of Brittany, between France and Great Britain. That was the only British territory under Nazi occupation. And there their job was to build fortifications to stop any invasion from the Allies. So
your father's taken away, and now it's you, your mother, and your two sisters.
Yes, and my mother was terrified because they were rounding up people every day, and she was concerned that at one point they could come for us.
So she needed to find a place.
And she had to find a place, and she had nobody to turn to, and eventually she met this lady at the street market. She didn't even know her, but somehow she felt that she could open up to her, and she told her that she was terrified that at any moment they could come and take us away. This lady, Madame Gallo, went back home to her husband. She told the story to her husband, and the next day her husband came with a cart, and we took whatever we could take with us to go and live with the Gallo family. The Gallo family was a Protestant family, Huguenot, and they had a very dark history of being persecuted themselves in the religious wars in France in the 17th century, and they were very sympathetic to the fate of the Jews at that time. And you know, for those of you who haven't visited the museum yet, on the second floor about the rescuers, you have the story of a small village called Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, where a Protestant pastor managed to save like 5,000 people, mostly Jews, but also resistance, in the surrounding villages. So the Gallo family took us with them, and it was very dangerous for them because they had. I was 4 years old. I was 5 years old at that time, and they had two daughters who were 4 and 3. So that meant that if we had been denounced by one of the neighbors, which could have very well happened actually, not only would we be taken away and sent to Auschwitz, and I wouldn't be here today, but also the Gallo family with their daughters were facing the same fate actually, because it was strictly prohibited to hide some Jews, and people who were caught hiding some Jews, they were promised the same fate as the Jews themselves.
Albert, you had shared with me that when you were at the home of the Gallots, and Mr. Gallot was a sculptor, and what did he tell us? What he did?
Monsieur Gallot was absolutely charming man, big heart, simple, decent people. He was a sculptor. He was making movie sets for the movie studios. And they had a big warehouse behind the house where they were storing all these sets. And with their two daughters, we had great hide-and-seek games in this warehouse.
And what I was struck by when you told me that, because for you as a little boy, that was fun. But you said that for your mother and your sisters who were older, they were constantly terrified.
Yes. Yeah, I was blessed to be that young because I didn't realize the danger. And I was never traumatized by the danger, by the fear, or anything like that. I suffered mostly from the food, the lack of food, and the poor quality of food, but that was everybody's fate, actually. But I was never terrified about what could happen. And I remember that at one night we were the Gallo family, and there was an alert, and we had to go to the shelters. And Monsieur Gallo had built a small shelter in the yard of his house. And we went down the shelter, and the youngest daughter, who was 3 years old at that time, said, "Tomorrow, if I find a bomb in the yard, I'm going to pick it up." That was the kind of statements of a 3-year-old. And we had no idea about that. We didn't know what a bomb meant. We didn't know that it could destroy us, anything like that. We didn't realize. My sisters and my mother and the Gallo parents, the family, the Monsieur and Madame Gallo, they were aware that if a bomb fell on our shelter, that would be the end of us. But to us, to me, I was never traumatized by that.
And between September, the fall of 1943, you stayed with the Gallos until the spring of 1944, but you had to leave there as well. Tell us why and what happened next.
Yeah, well, actually, the Gallo family was living in a small street. There were about 10 houses. It was mostly artists, painters, sculptors. And one painter, his wife, was pro-Nazi. She was a sympathizer of the Reich and the anti-Semite. And one day she said to Madame Gallo, "When are you going to get rid of that scum?" So there was a real danger that she might report us to the police or to the Gestapo, whatever. And that would be the end of us and the end of the Gallo family. So at that point, Madame Gallo and my mother decided that it might be safer for us to go back home, which we did. But I still have a wonderful memory of the Gallo, and I have eternal gratitude to them for what they did. It was really heroic.
And maybe we'll have time before we're done for you to tell how you honored them later.
Yes.
So there you have to go back to, you're able to get back into your apartment, but even there you're not safe, and it didn't last long.
No, we went back to our apartment, and sure enough, a few weeks later, it must have been more or less around D-Day. I'm not exactly sure about the date. Okay. You know, we didn't have radio. And I didn't read the newspapers, anything. I was not aware of the landing of Allies on the Normandy beaches. I was not aware of that. But apparently it must have been around that day. That was June 6, 1944. One morning, 2 police inspectors came to our house, knocked at the door. Madame Garih, yes, we came to take you away. That was what my mother had been dreading all along. She started shaking, you know, and she said, calm down, we are going to report we didn't find you, but you must not sleep in your beds tonight. You have to find another place to hide. So it's easier done, said than done, actually. And so it was 7 o'clock in the morning, 8 o'clock in the morning, I don't know. I was still in bed. My mother woke me up. I was already awakened by the commotion, but she took me out of bed and she dressed me, and we ran away. We went to see a social worker that she had been referred to, and she explained the situation, and the social worker said, look, you have to give me a few days. I cannot find a place like that overnight for you and your family. So in the meantime, try to see if you cannot sleep at your neighbor's, not in your apartment. And that's what we did. And I must say that we had wonderful neighbors. Our neighbors opened their doors to us. And my mother and I, we slept at our next door neighbors. They were a communist family. A couple with a daughter who was about my age, a few months younger than me. And my sisters slept at the lodge keeper downstairs. The lodge keeper was, you know, I never saw her husband dead because probably he had been taken prisoner with the French army. She was raising her children by herself. She had 2 boys, 13 and 14, and a little girl of 5. And my sister slept at the lodge keeper's apartment until the social worker came back to my mother and said, I found a place for each one of you. So my mother was placed as a governess with a family of about 8 or 10 children near the Eiffel Tower, and we were placed in Catholic boarding schools outside of Paris in a suburb northeast of Paris, and a suburb that is famous for those of you who may have read Les Misérables. It's Montfermeil. It's the place where Jean Valjean in Les Misérables met Cosette when she was going to get some water. And so we were there. I was in a Catholic boarding school for boys and my sisters in one for girls, and I was completely isolated. The only person who was showing me some affection at that time was the headmistress. I must have been her protégée, and she was always making sure that I was around, and she was wonderful with me. But the food was terrible, but that was nobody's fault. It was just that there was nothing to eat. So we were fed rotten beans. I remember the rotten beans because they made me sick, and I lost a lot of weight there. One day, I had a feast. The priest, who was suffering from some sort of ulcer or cancer or whatever, they found some potatoes and a small piece of butter, and they made him some mashed potatoes. And even that, the poor priest could not swallow them. And guess what? Who was fed the leftovers from the priest? Yours truly.
And you remember that.
I remember that.
That was a feast. That was a feast.
That was the only time that I had a decent food, and to this day I love mashed potatoes.
So after being both in the Catholic boarding school, your sisters were in another place, you had spent some time with another family, the Minatries.
Mm-hmm.
Paris is liberated in August 1944. The war, of course, would continue till April of 45, but Paris was liberated. You were 6 years old. What do you recall of liberation? What do you recall of that?
Everything.
Everything. Okay.
Everything. Actually, we were still in these Catholic boarding schools. As I said, I was completely isolated from my family. Of course, my mother could not write to us, could not come to visit us. It was too dangerous.
Because she's in hiding. Yep.
She's in hiding, we were in hiding. So she never came to visit us. So I was 6 years old, completely cut out of my family. The only contact I had with my family was with my sisters that I would meet every Sunday in church. We would go to Mass every Sunday, and that's when I would see my sisters. And even then, I didn't have much contact with them because they were with the girls and I was with the boys, and God forbid that we mix up.
Right. But at least you saw each other.
I may have exchanged a few words with them, but it was not very much. And one day, when we were in that school, it was the summer, so it was vacation actually. We didn't have class. We had class very occasionally. And I remember when we had class, I was the youngest. I was 6 years old. The others were from 7 up to 14. And being the youngest, and I already could read and write at that point, because my mother, when we were at the Gallo family, since we had nothing to do, she would teach me how to write and read. Mm-hmm. So I was the baby in that school. They put me with the babies, and I was making strokes like this. And when I could have written, letters, at least, maybe not words, but at least letters. And and one day, and also when we were in that school, sometimes we had some raids, and we had to go to the shelters. And one of the hobbies that we had, I was not the only one, actually, all the kids there did that. As soon as the raid was over and the sirens blasting the end of the alert, we would go back to the playground, and our hobby was to pick up pieces of shrapnel.
Pieces of metal from the bombs.
Yes, exactly. And I had jagged ones like that. I had a whole collection of them, which my mother quickly threw away when we got home, but anyway. That's what we were doing. And one day, one of the kids ran away from the school. It was in France. At that time, I don't know how it is now, but at that time you had two types of boarding schools. You had boarding schools for people from the upper crust, where they were groomed and all that, and they were very expensive and fancy and everything. And you had boarding school for kids who were kicked out of public schools because they were not manageable there. Mm-hmm. And that was the kind of public school I was in. So
this kid runs away.
He runs away, and he came back the next morning saying, "The Allies are coming." So we all went on the main street, and we saw the tanks. We saw the jeeps, we saw the trucks, we saw soldiers with a different kind of helmet, different kind of faces, smiling faces, friendly faces. And that's the first time I heard about Americans. I'd never heard of Americans before. I had heard about Italians, about Germans, about Russians, about English. Who are these people, the Americans? Where do they come from? I had no idea. So that was my first contact with Americans. Needless to say that I was seduced immediately, but...
And what happened immediately here?
Well, that was, I can almost tell you the date. Paris was liberated August 25th, 1944. We were liberated August 27th, 2 days later, because we were east. You know, the Germans, the Allies were pushing the Germans eastwards back to Germany. And so we were liberated on the 27th. I guess maybe a couple of days later, they restored the train service. And as soon as the train service, and Paris was liberated, so my mother could come out of her hiding place. And as soon as the train service was restored, she was on the first train and she came to see us. And one morning, I see my two sisters coming to my school. I was in the playground. I said, guess who's here? And you know what? At the age of 6, how easy it is and how fast it is to forget about your loved ones. I had no idea who could be there, so I pushed my sister around. I was curious, and when I saw my mother, of course, I jumped into her arms, and she, when she saw me, she was so appalled. You know, how I looked, and I was so skinny and sick. So I remember she had, you know, everything was rationed, so she had ration tickets to buy a loaf of bread. She bought a loaf of bread. We swallowed the loaf of bread in no time. That's how hungry we were. We were starved, literally. And she took me home right away the same day. And she, for whatever reason, she went back the next day to pick up my sisters. Maybe it was too much to do that in one day. So she had to go back. And she brought back my sisters the next day. In the meantime, when I was alone at home, I was in bed, I was sick, and I was hungry. And there was nothing to eat in the house except for a green apple. And that was the worst possible thing I should have eaten. But I was, 6 years old, I was hungry. I saw that apple, I grabbed it, and I ate it in no time. And I was under the custody of our neighbor, next door neighbor, Madame Ménétrier, who had the key. And as soon as I finished the apple, I heard the key in the lock, and she was coming to check up on me. And she said, "What did you eat?" I said, "Nothing." And she discovered them. But anyway, my mother came back in the evening with my sisters. So we were reunited in a tiny apartment, in freedom. And that was in end of August, or maybe the very first days of September. September 21st or 22nd or 23rd, I'm not sure exactly, was Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year. My mother was dressing me. Oh, I forgot to mention, in the meantime, my father, who was in these Channel Islands, 1 month before D-Day, they were moved to the Straits of Dover, which is the shortest distance between France and Britain. And they were repairing the fortifications because the Allies were doing whatever they could to make the Germans believe that if there was an invasion, it would take place there, which would have made sense because it was the shortest distance between France and Britain. So they were bombarding them all the time. And so the 900 detainees who were with my father in this island were transferred to the Straits of Dover. And one day my father told me that at one point, when there were raids there, they had no shelters or anything, so they were laying flat on the ground. And my father was laying flat next to a German soldier. And when the raid was over, my father stood up and the German soldier stayed on the ground. He had been killed. So it was close calls, actually.
Albert, yes, tell us how your father, how he was able to get away from that slave labor camp on that island and make it back to you.
Well, as I said, they were transferred to the Straits of Dover probably in September. The Germans put them on a train bound for Germany, probably to send them either to a death camp or to a slave labor factory or whatever. And the train from the northern of France to Germany had to go across Belgium, northern Belgium actually. And at one point the train was stopped by Belgian resistance who had blown up the railroad or a bridge or whatever it was. And the train was stopped, there was a battle, and in the confusion the Germans released the 900 inmates. And my father, after spending a few days there to try to regain some strength, started walking back home. And he walked all the way from northern Belgium to Paris, which was about a 200-mile walk. And he arrived in the morning of Rosh Hashanah. So at that point, we were liberated in Paris. And my mother was dressing us to go to synagogue for the first time since after the liberation. And there was a knock on the door. My mother went to open. It took her a few seconds to realize that it was her husband there, because he was like a ghost actually. He was so gaunt and.
Had she known that he was even alive?
Yes, she knew that he was on his way, because he was there with a first cousin of his who came back a few days earlier and said he's on his way. He's coming back.
He's on his way.
So.
And
yeah.
do you remember when he came home?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that when he came home, my mother went to open the door, and he was in terrible shape.
He was in terrible shape.
Yes, and that's all I remember. I don't remember all the details about that, but all I know is that our nuclear family was safe. We all survived. My father, my mother, my sisters, and me. We all survived, but we lost. My mother lost her mother, my grandmother, who was killed during the Exodus, a brother and a sister and nephews, plus some of her cousins were deported and never came back. And my father also had some cousins which I never met, because I was a baby at that time, so I never met them. But I know that he lost some cousins who were deported. Actually, these cousins lived in a district of Paris where there were a lot of Jews, and the building where they were living, there were a lot of Jewish families there. And so they were easy targets for the roundups, and that's how they ended up. And today, on that building, you have a plaque saying that on whatever date it was, 42, 43, they rounded up X number of Jews, and they were sent to Auschwitz and never came back. So after that, that was in September 1944. October 1st, 1944 was back to school day. It was my first day at school, and I was so excited about that. That was a very happy moment.
Albert, there's so much more you could share with us. For example, you would continue to live in Paris, for the next 6, 7 months, 8 months while the war continued until it was over in April 1945. Your parents trying to regain a sense of normalcy, go back to work, and so much more you could tell about your life after the war. But I think if we have a few minutes, if you don't mind, maybe we can turn to our audience to see if they have a couple questions.
Sure.
We have time for just a few questions. We have 2 microphones, one in each aisle. We ask that you use a microphone. Try to make your question as brief as you can, and I'll repeat it just to be sure that we all hear it before Albert responds to it. I'm hoping you'll stay with us through the brief question period, because we're going to turn back to Albert in just a moment to close our program. So if you have anybody brave enough to step up and go to the mic, we'd appreciate it. Let me tell you this, that when Albert's finished, he will remain on the stage, and you are most welcome to come up on the stage afterwards and ask him the question that you may be thinking about, or just shake his hand or get your photo taken with him. We encourage you to do that after the program. I want to remind you that we have first-person programs each Wednesday and Thursday until the middle of August, so that we hope that you can come back. All of our programs will be available through the museum's YouTube page, so you can see Albert's program again or any of our other programs this year. So please take advantage of that if you can. And when Albert finishes, our photographer Joel, who's going to come up on the stage, and he's going to take a photo of Albert with you as the backdrop. So that makes for a very nice picture, a portrait for Albert after this program. It's our tradition at First Person that our first person gets the last word. So on that note, I'd like to turn back to Albert to close today's program.
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about my own story. I've told you enough about that. But I read somewhere that kids who were in the camps, while they were in the camps, they never saw a bird, they never saw a flower, they never saw a butterfly. And that's things that we take for granted, that are part of environment. And can you imagine a kid? A lot of kids were in the camps. They were subjected to experiments, actually, and they could never see one of these beauties of nature. All they saw was death and stench, and that's it. So I think it's very important to realize what we have when we have our freedom, and that's my message, actually.
Thank you, Albert. Thank you very much.